So, in the early history of the church, as the church became, uh, it had been a persecuted minority, and then it became the legal and then the established religion, more and more people felt the need to get off by themselves and away from the busy cities and to really focus on developing their relationship with God. And so there was a movement, the monastic movement, and they went out into the wilderness. In many places it was the desert. And so this was a movement which you've maybe heard of, the desert fathers and the desert mothers. These were early people who felt so called to develop their relationship with God that they wanted to go off by themselves or go off into a community of other brothers or brothers and sisters and work on growing their relationship with God. One of the writers, one of the early, in fact, he's known now in history as one of the most significant authors, prolific authors, was a guy named John Cassian. And he went off into these communities, traveled around in them, and then he wrote about it. And there's a multi-volume book called the Philokalia, which is very a big deal in the Eastern Orthodox Church, has a section written by John Cassian about these early church fathers. And he talks about this one time when there was a debate. The leaders of these different communities came together, and they were talking about different things, and they got into a little bit of a discussion or a debate about what's the most important virtue. Of all the things that we should try to cultivate into our lives, of all the things that a monk needs, what do they need the most? And he said, and other people in this group came to the agreement that what monks in the, let's say, 4th, 5th century in the desert, what they needed most was discretion or discernment or wisdom. Like more than love, more than joy, more than peace, patience. What they needed was discernment. And here's how he said, discernment, this is John Cassian's words now, discernment is the most important virtue for the seeker of God to develop. As Abba Moses, another one of the leaders, said, discernment is the mother, the guardian, and the guide of all virtues. And what he said is that if people don't have this, they'll get really amped up in their zeal for something, and people would literally starve themselves to death because they were so zealous about fasting, let's say, or they would get sucked into some kind of crazy teaching, or they would get pulled into some sort of temptation. And he said if all of this earnestness and zeal that we have for our spiritual lives, if that is not focused by, governed by wisdom, discernment, it's going to take us down crazy paths. Now, that guy, way back in that time, he had some really important things to say for the church today. Now, we are talking about, in these weeks, the vision of our church, what we want to focus on building Bethel Church to be. And here's a way we put it, some wording for it that I talked about last week, that in a society that's morally and spiritually adrift, that's marked by ever-increasing turmoil and suffering, we want to be an island of sanity, experiencing and proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, that language might be unfamiliar to you, that idea of what does it mean to be an island of sanity in a crazy world? What would that look like? How would we do that? And that's what we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks. So this is actually now printed in your bulletin. Wanted you to have this, the exact wording of this. So here's a thought that we have about how we want to be an island of sanity, what it means for us, Bethel Church, to be an island of sanity. That is, number one, we will devote ourselves to seeing the world as it is, relying on wisdom and discernment. We will not be able to find healing for ourselves or help others unless we understand and deal with what is really going on in our world, in our lives, in our community. Today, this requires ever increasing degrees of discernment and wisdom, intentionally dismantling our filters, media bubbles, susceptibility to the lies and manipulation of mass media and social media, and the reactivity that is fostered by our unprocessed trauma and the increasing violence, overt and subvert, around us. And you know what I mean by reactivity? You could just mention a word sometimes, or you use some sort of code word and someone gets super ticked off, right? They just get triggered by just saying something. And sometimes we can be that way too. So we want to deal with that susceptibility. Let's talk about this more in detail. And what I want to say as we begin is that I believe, this is my opinion now, but see if you would agree, that wisdom has never been more important to have. Discernment has never been more important for us to have, and seems like it's never been harder to get. So, information is everywhere. Wisdom is harder to find. People who want to be known as experts and portray themselves as experts, people who have ideas about how you should live, what you should think, who you should vote for, are a dime a dozen. They're everywhere, and they're competing against each other for our attention. And how do we live with discernment in the midst of this world? So, first off, why do we need this? There's a 2-page outline in your bulletin with a number of fill-in-the-blank kinds of things. You know, if you want to write these down, you can. If nothing else, can help you follow along. Why is this so important? I've kind of hinted at this already. First, because we need it so that we're not led astray. We're going to talk in a little bit about what Solomon has to say here in this passage, but we need wisdom because there are ways for us, for our lives, to go into the ditch, right? On one side or the other. There are pitfalls. There are dangers that are lurking all around us. So we want to develop discernment and wisdom because we need that. But then also, as we're thinking about this in terms of the vision of our church, being an island of sanity, we need this because we're not going to be able to help anybody if we ourselves are just as confused, ignorant, brainwashed as our neighbors are. Again, this is a variation of that principle that you can't give what you don't have. And we are concerned that the people who are spiritually lost, who don't have Jesus, are living with anxiety and stress and uncertainty about how to live, and they're bashed around or beaten around by the different ways of the world and mindsets of the world. Okay, so if they come and they relate to us and we try to reach out to them, if we are just as anxious and stressed and confused and batted around, and if we are so reactive to things, we don't have much to help them with. And they're going to look to us as representatives of the gospel and see that there's not much different about our lives. We don't really have much to help them with. So there's a credibility issue that we need to deal with in the church. And so we need this for ourselves, and we need this if we want to help anybody else. So what does Solomon have to say? This is a great chapter, and this is written in the language of an old man sharing wisdom with a young man. Okay? So he says, "My son, listen to this." So first off, he talks about our part in this, which is we are called to seek wisdom and to really seek wisdom. So again, if I could just emphasize this point for a minute, one of the things that sometimes a message that gets communicated in churches when we really want to emphasize the power of the gospel, and we really want to emphasize how much everything changes when we turn our lives over to God and when we invite Christ to come into our lives. Sometimes we kind of give the impression that you become a Christian, you turn your life over to Jesus, you invite Jesus into your life, and then it just sort of, and we all lived happily ever after, right? Well, that begins this journey, and it's a journey that some people take, and some people just sort of sit on their hands the rest of their lives. Here in this chapter, we're challenged, and again, we're reading this now as New Testament Christians, as people who've invited Christ into our lives. We now have the Holy Spirit living in us. We are still called to pursue this. Listen to how he puts it. If you accept my words and store up my commands within you, if you turn your ear to wisdom, apply your heart to understanding, if you call out for insight, cry aloud for understanding, if you look for it as for silver, search for it as for hidden treasure. Like, this is really important to me. I'm really trying to build my life around this pursuit of developing wisdom, developing discernment. I need that in order to live. That's our part. And then, when we do that, the promise is fulfilled. Verses 5 and 6. If you do that, if you seek wisdom, he says in verse 5, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. James 1 verse 5, if anyone asks, or if anyone lacks wisdom, that person should ask for it, should seek it, and God will give that wisdom. And other places we discover that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's understanding who we are, how we fit into this world, and God has a calling for us. That is the path that we're on. We begin to understand that God answers the prayer for us when we seek for wisdom. Just like Solomon, as a young man, he prayed for wisdom. When God asked him what he wanted, he asked for wisdom, and God gave it to him. That's the way it's going to work for all of us. But we seek it. We pursue it. We ask for it. And then when we get wisdom, when wisdom comes into our lives, look at all the ways that wisdom helps us, the way that wisdom blesses us. First, people, again, remember now, this is the book of Proverbs. Proverbs are observations about how life generally works. All right? They're not like perfect predictions about everything, but they're observations about how life generally works. And generally speaking, it is true that people who are wise have more success in life. Verse 7, he holds victory in store for the upright. Now, does sometimes Christians have struggles? Of course. In fact, Jesus says sometimes if you're a follower of mine, you're going to have more troubles. You're going to have more challenges, unique challenges. Yes, that's all true. But at the same time, there's so much help that comes into our lives when we are following the way of wisdom. Wisdom brings success. Wisdom also brings protection. He is a shield. This is the last part of verse 7. He is a shield for those whose walk is blameless. He guards the course of the just and protects the way of his faithful ones. Now, we don't need to raise our hands here, but how many of us have done something that we knew was stupid, we knew was not what God wanted us to do, and then we paid a big price for it? Like, think about so much of the suffering in our lives, if we're going to be really honest, is stuff that we brought on ourselves by doing foolish things or by not doing things that we should have done, right? So here's this reality, that if we understand how life works, and if we live according to that, the way that God's laid out life, life is so much better. Look, life is so much easier. Just ask someone who's hungover because of what they did the night before. Or ask someone whose lives are in shambles because of moral choices they've made, or whatever. So anyway, it saves us. Then it shows us what to do, how to live, verses 9 and 10. Then you will understand what's right and just and fair, every good path. Wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. We'll have wisdom, and then it's going to protect us in two specific ways. It will protect us from the schemes of evil people, verse 11 through 15. It will protect you, it will guard you from the ways of wicked men, from those whose words are perverse, leave straight paths, walk in dark ways, they delight in doing wrong. And if we have wisdom, we're going to figure that out. We'll be able to see through that kind of manipulation. And then also, it will save us from the temptations that are available. And I think I have the verse wrong. Oh, no, it is right. Verses 16, it actually goes through the end of the chapter. And I didn't read it all. You can read it all, but just it will save you from the adulteress, from the wayward wife. And she's left the partner of her youth, ignored the covenant she made before God. Her house leads down to death, and so on. Look, ladies, don't be offended by this. This is written to men, okay? So if this was written to women, it would say to you, it will save you from the adulterer, from the man who will lead you astray. This is an equal opportunity protection right here. So that's what wisdom will do for us. And I'll just say again, we need that today. Discernment, as John Cassian said, discernment is the most important virtue for the seeker of God to develop. Discernment is the mother, the guardian, and the guide of all virtues. So why don't we have it? Why is this in such short supply today? Well, first, most obvious, we do not have because we do not ask. We do not seek it. Remember, Jesus said, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. Well, if we don't do that, if we don't pursue it, we're not going to have it. It doesn't just automatically, rain from heaven at night when we sleep. We seek it. We study. We pursue it. And so we do not have it in our lives if we don't value it enough to seek it. Number two, we don't have it because we don't understand where it's found. And this is going to get us to a different subject. It's something that I preached on not that long ago. And when we send out the information about today's sermon, we will also include a link to that sermon. But it's a whole sermon on where can wisdom be found. And the idea that wisdom ultimately can be found in the Scripture. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. or it's the beginning of wisdom, but it's also found in the interactions among people. It's found in the streets. It's found by the gates of the city, not just in the temple. And the idea that we as Christians need to value this interaction that's happening in our world of people who make observations about how life generally works. So even if they're not followers of Christ, like, let's say, an Aristotle or Socrates or whatever, there are people who have great knowledge and expertise that we can learn from. Anyway, that's, again, a sermon for a different time, and how we relate that then to the knowledge that we have in Scripture. We need to have a broad understanding of the wisdom and discernment that is required for us to live today. If we don't have that, we're going to struggle. And then finally, and this is what the vision point we have today really speaks to, is that we have a unique challenge today in that our world militates against discernment and wisdom. So we put it this way: our lives are saturated with media and messages. But if you think about where most of those messages, where that media comes from, none of those sources really want to help us to be more discerning. In fact, I would go so far as to say most of those, they don't really care about making our lives better. They just want our money, or they just want our help to do what they want to do. They want to recruit you so that you can help them do whatever it is they want to do. Politically, socially, whatever, some sort of market thing they want you to buy, whatever that. So all of these people are giving me all these messages, and I'll tell you, the time I figured this out. When I was a new Christian, I was in the early days of Focus on the Family. Remember Focus on the Family, James Dobson? And he was a really well-respected therapist, and he had teaching about marriage and having good relationships and how to be a good husband and how to be a good dad. And it was awesome. And I got on the Focus on the Family email list, and there was a certain point, it seemed like more and more of these messages have to do less and less with marriages and relationships, but more about what's going wrong in our country. And it was like less and less about helping me in my marriage and more about, man, you got to watch out for what they're doing in Congress now. And there was a certain point. Now, I don't care what you think about the message of the Dobson. I agree with almost all of it. But I remember this email. It was about some particular issue. And it was all about, this is horrible, this is terrible what's happening, give us more money. You need to give us more money because these terrible things are happening and you need to support us. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, I sort of see what they're saying, but there's these other parts of what's happening that he's not telling us, or that they're not telling us. They're sort of like skewing the news to make it even more and more frightening because that helps them get more money. Do you see how that happens? Even good ministries, it's so tempting to do that. And so now I'm using an example of a good ministry with, in a lot of ways, high integrity, and yet that was happening from them. And now multiply that by 1,000. I mean, how many of us are getting messages about this and that? They want us to do this. They want our attention. They want our help. They want this. And you know what? Most of them are telling us some things that are true. But there's other stuff they're not telling us if it undermines what they're wanting to say. And I also want to tell you, I'm a pastor in a church. I have that same temptation. When I'm talking to people about the gospel or I'm talking to people about our church, it's very easy for me to just want to give people the good news or the news that's going to appeal to them, that's going to convince them to be a part of the thing. And if we as a church just want to get more people in the door, and we're not really focused on helping them make their lives better, that's a really dangerous place to be. So it's really, really important for us to keep that clear. And it's also really, really important for us to recognize that so much of the information that we're getting around us, it's propaganda that is trying to get something from us. So, how do we get wisdom? Number one, we must value it. Talked about that before. We must pray for it. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. Gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Pray for it. We must seek it. And there's ways of seeking it, which I talked about in the previous message, and you can, again, hear that. We read, we study, we spend time with wise people, we hear the different things that we take in the different things that we hear or read, and then see how they relate to the scriptural wisdom. So we seek it, and then number 4, we filter out non-wisdom. And once again, this is where significant battle is being waged right now. For your soul, for my soul, for our families, for our kids, for our well-being. Here's the stat, everybody. The average American spends 8 hours and 14 minutes every day connecting to some media on a screen. Computer screen, TV, phone, and most of that is not work. So some of that's entertainment, but even that entertainment pushes us in a certain direction, right? Even that entertainment, quote unquote, gives us a message. But it gets worse, because we're only now getting a glimpse of how AI is being used and going to be used to further promote the disinformation and to manipulate people for commercial purposes and for social political purposes. Let me give you an example. So these are 2 deep fake pictures where AI is so good right now. They don't just Photoshop people, but you can put enough pictures in, and the AI can figure out a person's appearance, and then you can basically have that person do anything you want. Both of these are artificially generated pictures of the Pope. Someone just has it in for the Pope, I guess. And so the Pope never wore that coat. The Pope was never running from the police. But I think maybe you also know that there is now deep fake audio. And so Mark, we talked about this, that there are people who you get a message, a phone, you have a phone conversation with someone, but it's actually not a person, and it can be the voice of someone that you know, but it's actually not them, because they teach the video, or they teach this thing to sound like a certain person, and then they can, have it say whatever that wants. But here's the thing, you guys. I think it's already available. um, and it's not been widely deployed yet. But you could turn on the news uh, tonight, and you could see a video of Donald Trump doing something horrible or Joe Biden doing something horrible, and it wouldn't even be them. It would just be a complete fake video. And so it becomes super, super important for us now in the context of being barraged by manipulative information, and now how much of it's false information. And we're moving into an election cycle, which is going to elevate the crazy even higher. Do you think that's a fair prediction? I don't think I have to be a prophet to make that prediction. Uh, so, our vision at Bethel is we want to be an island of sanity. In order to do that, each of us, we will devote ourselves to seeing the world as it is, relying on wisdom and discernment. We can't find healing for ourselves or help others unless we understand and deal with what is really going on. Today, this requires ever-increasing degrees of discernment and wisdom, intentionally dismantling our filters, media bubbles, susceptibility to the lies and manipulation of mass and social media, and the reactivity that is fostered by our unprocessed trauma and the increasing violence, overt and subvert, all around us. Jesus said to the disciples, and he says to us, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be shrewd as snakes and gentle as doves. So I'm going to end by going back to this Proverbs 2 chapter, and instead of making it conditional, I'm just going to make these as encouragements. Can we devote ourselves to this? My son and my daughter, accept my words, store up my commands within you. Turn your ear to wisdom, apply your heart to understanding. Call out for insight, cry out for understanding. Look for it as for silver, and search for it as for treasure.